FDA's accelerated approval program has helped bring several cancer treatments quickly to the market. But a new study found that about half of those fast-track drugs are not actually helping or improving quality of life. Dr. Celine Gounder is here with us on set to provide some medical insight into this. She is the editor-at-large for public health at KFF. Thanks so much for being with us, Celine. There's so much to get into. I want to start with explaining the actual approval process for drugs in America. How does that happen?
So we have sort of two different pathways. You have your standard pathway where we look at, did the medication, in this case, many of these are cancer drugs, did it allow you to live longer? Was your quality of life better? But we have an accelerated approval pathway that really was at the very beginning developed for HIV drugs about 30 some years ago, where what we look at are what we call surrogate markers. So things like your blood test, your scan. So it's sort of like saying, for a football team, who's winning in the first quarter, and based on that, trying to predict who's going to win the overall game.
Right. And prediction is such a big piece of this puzzle. We know, obviously, not every drug that's experimental will pan out and actually be successful. So what happens if that does occur?
Well, if a drug goes through the accelerated approval pathway and is later found not to be effective, it is taken off the market. In fact, we just saw this happen with an ALS drug. And so you might wonder why we're even going through this accelerated pathway.
Right.
Well, there are certain conditions like certain cancers, ALS, HIV back in the day, where people were so desperate that even with just preliminary data, they were willing and wanting, advocating for access.
And I wonder if patients know the risks when they go into something like this, because often it can be really expensive too. Do they know this is just a chance of working out?
Well, and this is the real problem, because a lot of physicians don't get into the details of, was this an accelerated approval, a regular approval, what was the data on which it was approved? And so physicians, because of these different pathways, they really do need to educate themselves to counsel their patients and say, look, we're not as sure if this is going to work. And there are some very real side effects. So there is a trade-off here.
And something interesting here is that some of these drugs are actually granted full approval despite not actually living up to some of the benefits. Explain why.
Again, I think this is a reflection of some people are just so desperate for something. Their patients, their families. There are some very terrible illnesses like ALS where people die within just a year or two of diagnosis, where there's really not much available to them. And so I think some of this is really the result of activists putting pressure on the FDA to make these approvals.
So is there any way this process could work? Or is this just par for the course in, developing new drugs in America?
Well, I think there are some questions as to whether this makes sense. In fact, some of the HIV activists came around to saying, look, actually, this accelerated approval pathway is not helping us because we end up having more side effects. This is back in the 80s and 90s. We end up having more horrible side effects. We're still dying anyway. And so this has actually made our quality of life worse. So there is some balance to be had there.
Okay. An interesting conversation. We'll have to leave it there. Dr. Gounder, thanks so much.